However, the reason why there should be a decision maker and who he should be is arbitrary and irrational. This is because legitimacy is not a legal but a psychological phenomenon. It comes from the conviction that the ruler has the power to set the rules and that his subjects must obey. Obedience is based on the will of the subjects and not on the strength of the ruler. Obedience establishes an unlimited power. If you think about war, genocide, concentration camps, torture, all these evils have their source in the voluntary obedience by gullible subjects. Obedience is an instinct. It is deeply embedded in our nature. Oh, sorry, we have to. Is an instinct. It is embedded in our nature as social animals. Skills of cooperation, of course, are the human character that gave our race and ancestors the advantage on all other animals. And rules are the balance point between the quest for individual survival and the advantages of social organization. Even the most primitive forms of division of labor made life more comfortable. And such basic social organization helped natural leaders and elites to emerge as judges and rule makers. Natural authority, at the end of the day, is the model of the family extended to bigger communities. A further side to the concept of legitimacy is the instinct of conformity. Humans tend to follow the majority. Empathy and learning by observation and imitation are a typical human feature. Plus, natural selection may have played a role. Communities with higher cohesion and with more intelligent leaders were the winners in the struggles with forces of nature and with other human beings. So leaders were respected not because of their right to command, but because of their qualities. During time, of course, such a system seems to be predestined to degeneration and failure, caused by the connection between self-interest and the obedience instinct. As the German sociologist Oppenheimer put it, there are two ways to achieve wealth. On one side we have homesteading, production, and voluntary exchange, what he called the economic means. On the other side we have the violent or fraudulent appropriation of other people's wealth, what he called the political means. The easiest way to achieve other people's wealth is the abuse of obedience. The position as a leader, commanding obedience, is a very big temptation for criminals who intend to exploit the obedience instinct to their own good and to their subjects' detriment in a zero-sum game. Now, as far as the second question is concerned, is there law by nature? There have been two basic approaches: natural law and legal positivism. We'll start with natural law. According to the schools of thought of natural law, law is inspired by God or by natural reason. The ancient Roman precept of sum cuique tribuere, which means basically respect other people's property, summed up the idea of a natural law as a body of general principles common to all peoples. Medieval scholars merged the Roman principles with Catholic theology, and so the kings, the emperors, the popes were God-given authorities, but also caretakers, simple caretakers and enforcers of the law that was eternal and not modifiable at will. In contrast, the modern legal thought is dominated by legal positivism. The positivists' answer to the question, what is law, is very simple. Law is whatever the authority in power decides according to a certain procedure. So, also the origin of positivism can be traced back to Roman law that contained the principle, whatever pleases the emperor has the value of law. This was exactly the tradition upon which absolutism and the modern national states were built after the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century. The era of absolutism and enlightenment affirmed that law is man-made, that the sovereign is the supreme legislator, and that laws must be written according to scientific principles to further the well-being of the subjects. So this is the birth of social engineering. Modern positivism begins that identifies law with what is enacted in a certain country at a certain time. Just to mention three prominent positive thinkers, we can mention Hart, who spoke of a rule of recognition, an unwritten rule that defines legitimate authority. Austin, on the other side, taught that the content of law is irrelevant in order to define laws as such. Law for Austin is a procedural definition. Finally, Kelsen thought that the legitimacy of all norms is derived from a basic norm, a Grundnorm, that affirms the constitutional validity of the legislative procedure. Reflection about conformity of such laws to an ethical standard does not belong to legal scholarship, according to the schools of positivism. So legal scholars were transformed into technicians and textual interpreters. The quest for the just law exited jurisprudence and was completely transferred to the arena of politics, of philosophy, and sociology. Now, my question is there a possibility to establish a concept of law based on the concept of human action, of praxeology, as developed by the Austrian economists? According to Ludwig von Mises, the basic recognition of all human sciences is that man acts purposefully in a world of scarce resources. Human action is an axiom, according to Mises, a logical postulate whose denial would entail a contradiction. In fact, one cannot deny acting because the simple fact of denying action is an action itself. Mises called this science praxeology, a neologism derived from ancient Greek, and he said, of course, economy is the most important part of praxeology, but there are other parts of praxeology that should be studied, like sociology, psychology, and law, which is the topic of my speech. So, law is a kind of action whose aim is to regulate the actions of other human beings. Through commands, law establishes rights, which are claims on other people's behaviors, and corresponding duties, which are behaviors that ought to be observed. Law, and this is a very important point, is a function of language, because rules can be expressed only using words. Language, in turn, is the expression of thought, and thought is an axiom exactly as human action. To deny that one thinks, it needs to have a thought, and so who denies thinking falls in a logical contradiction. Further, the axiom of thought entails a proof of self-ownership, which is the basic concept of law according to praxeology. Thought is the original appropriation of selfhood by establishing the mental unity of one's person. Thought, we could say, enables man to homestead his body. The deepest meaning of thought is that we own ourselves using our mental abilities. Language, it is interesting to note, is itself the first rule of social interaction. It is a social agreement by which humans appropriate the world, imposing names on reality and communicating between themselves. The tacit agreement between the speakers to use language according to a set of semantics and a logical structure, which we call grammar, constitutes the basic norm. Here we really can speak of a basic norm that makes law possible. So how would law look like according to praxeology? Law, according to praxeology, must be consistent with the basic principle I mentioned of man defined as an acting self-owner. So being an individual self-owner is the ultimate synthesis of the human condition, and any law that conflicts with self-ownership cannot be consistent with human nature. So the concept of natural law that expresses self-ownership is the non-aggression principle most libertarians are familiar with. According to the non-aggression principle, the initiation of force against the physical integrity and the private property of another peaceful human being is forbidden. In a free legal system, particular laws should be discovered starting from the basic principles of self-ownership and non-aggression. Of course, as any legal scholar knows, the devil is in the details. So the simple recognition of basic principles is very far away from the establishment of a workable legal system. So how should such a legal system based on the non-aggression principle be developed and constructed? Law, in my opinion, is simply a service, as many more, and the right suggestion about how such a service should be produced comes from economy, of course. So the basic rule in economy is that a monopolist will render a service with rising prices and decreasing quality. Free competition instead benefits the consumer because of higher and increasing quality and lower prices. So what is true for anything else is not different for laws. The crafting of laws should be left with private agents selling their legislative services. This may seem very strange for us because we live in a world where making laws is a well-established monopoly of professional politicians. However, strange as it may seem, there are lots of historical examples of privately developed laws that worked perfectly and still are used. Just to cite two very big and very important examples, we have the law of international commerce in the Middle Ages, the Lex Mercatoria, that still builds the core principles of modern company and commercial law. It was developed by private arbitrators and it didn't even have a structure of enforcement. It was accepted by the community. A Roman law is the other very big example, has been used up to the beginning of the 20th century in Europe and was developed mainly by scholars during the centuries, and most civil codes of continental Europe still are based on Roman law. So compared to this ideal system where we have a law made on the market where there are competing legislative agencies and sellers of legal services, where are we now? As I mentioned, the dominating philosophy of law is legal positivism. Legal analysis is supposed to be value-free. Legal scholars are not supposed to judge if laws are just. They are just interpreters of what the politics give them. Of course, there have been thoughts about how to guarantee the contents of law and to guarantee that the legislators do not exceed the boundaries of justice. These guarantees are constitutionalism, democracy, and international law. According to, according to constitutionalism, there is a fundamental law that everyone is deemed to have accepted, and this law contains an enumeration of principles that the legislator must respect. But the interpretation of constitutions rests on the monopoly of judges. Judges are employees of the government, and in the long run, you can be sure, the American Constitution is the biggest example hereof, that the interpretation will be the one appreciated by their employer. Another guarantee is democracy. Voters, it is assumed, will be not so stupid and elect representatives that damage their interests. However, history teaches that the assumption of democracy is flawed. Transaction costs of informed voting and the relative irrelevance of the individual vote make democracy the perfect system for criminals and demagogues who are elected fooling their voters. Last attempt is international law. International conventions about human rights aim to restrict national legislators. But the possible reactions in international law, moral suasion, economic sanctions, and war are either ineffective or bring about a greater evil. So these systems do not work. how does the principle of self-ownership fare in our current situation? On first sight, it may appear that it is defended. There are laws against murdering, stealing, slavery, and so on. But this is an illusion, because laws are not universal and equal. Laws are usually valid and enforceable only against some persons and not against others. Murder and slavery are prohibited, but war and conscription are legitimate. Robbery is forbidden, but the government has the power to appropriate everyone's wealth by taxation. So the problem of the modern legal system is the double standard. We have two systems, public law and private law. What is possible for public law is not possible for private law. So public law enables a caste of privilege to live off the production of wealth by their subjects and to engage in actions that would be criminal for other people. What is to be done? Fighting governments with their own means is useless. Rebellion and participation in the political game is useless. The only revolution, I think, is that of our minds. Kant famously said, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed inability to use his understanding without another's guidance. So the resurgence of libertarianism and of the Austrian school of economics is the beginning, in my opinion, of a revolution. Legal scholars must appropriate again their right to judge the justice of laws, and to do this not from a political or philosophical point of view, but from a legal point of view, from a scientific praxeological perspective. Only this will free legal scholars from their subservient role as interpreters of the government will. And with this exercise of wishful thinking, I thank you for your attention.
One or two short questions, please.
The phrase is not mine. I like use John Rawls, but I would like for you to consider to comment this phrase. Justice is not reconcilable with truth.
Well, as it is apparent from my lecture, I don't agree. I think that justice and law should be derived from some basic truths. Self-ownership may seem to be a very simple and even somehow disappointing basic truth, because if you think about it, yes, of course, we are self-owners, it's not that much. But basing of this simple truth, you can construct the whole system and the whole edifice of law on self-defense and on respect of the person and of private property. So one of the authors I mostly disagree with is exactly John Rawls, because his idea of the veil of ignorance and the construction of some theoretical system behind the veil of ignorance, in my opinion, is a flawed philosophy, and it leads to socialism at the end of the day.
And the second question?
If I understood you correctly, Mises is saying that thoughts are also human actions. And there I must say I would have a different opinion, because an action is an action. When I plan to make a trip tomorrow, then there will be an action tomorrow. But I think, and this is a preparation of an action, so to say that thinking is already an action, I think this is too much for me. Yeah? And the second point is your last here. Legal scholars can and must judge the justice of the law. They cannot judge because the word has a double meaning. They only can be discussed, criticized, and so on. They have no authority to judge. So the wording, I think, is slightly exaggerated.
Okay, first point. No, Mises said action is an axiom. What I added is thought is an axiom too. So as it is impossible not to act, it is impossible not to think, because in both ways, saying, if I say you cannot act, I am acting. So it's a contradiction. At the same time, if I say it's impossible to think, thought doesn't exist. This too is an illogical contradiction, because I am thinking.
Yeah, but is thought an action?
No, thought is not an action.
Okay,
I agree with you.
agree.
Yeah. I totally agree with you. Yes. Axiom. So maybe I did axiom. No,
the word axiom is
it's a logical postulate.
Not the entire.
But not to act is action.
Sorry?
Not to act
Is an
is
action,
action.
of course, yes.
So thinking
The last question.
might be an action.
Very, very short.
And no, the second was the judge.
The second part, yes. What I mean by judging is judging scientifically,
Okay.
discussing.
Okay, we agree.
And so this should
Discussing,
be
criticizing, all
yeah,
that.
not judging as a judge endowed with authority, of course.
Okay.
I have an impression that most of the people would like to have like a master or someone telling them what to do. And I don't know if that's real, but that's how I feel about it. And I'm wondering if it's possible to have a society just like changing minds, like in a more rational way, not like in a like how people want to behave.
This is, I think, the greatest doubt that all libertarians still have. There is a very nice short novel by Pessoa, which is called the Anarchist Banker. And basically the story says the banker was an anarchist in his youth, but then working with other anarchists, he discovered that they just wanted a leader. They wanted someone to tell them what to do. And so he grew more and more depressed about his mission as an anarchist, and he ended up being a banker and someone belonging to the system. And he says, smoking his cigar and drinking his very expensive brandy, he says, yes, I would be an anarchist, but it's impossible. I think this is the biggest doubt we all have. Who knows if it's possible to build a free society? Right now we don't have a free society, I agree with you.
Thank you very much,
you.
Mr. Fusillo. Thank you.
Action.